Welcome to the Vue.js Masterclass. Vue.js is a JavaScript framework used for building the user interfaces. But what does that actually mean? Well, in simple terms, Vue.js makes our lives a lot easier when building a modern web applications. It helps organize our code, handle interactivity, and manage complex UI logic in much more structured and efficient way. Now, with so many frameworks and libraries out there like React.js, Angular, and Svelte, why should you even consider learning Vue.js? Well, it's easy to learn, perfect for beginners but powerful enough for the pros. It's flexible, meaning you can use it as little or as much as you want. It's component based, meaning you can build your UI with reusable blocks, something which we are going to be covering later in this course. It's popular, there is a huge community and tons of resources out there to learn Vue.js. It's lightweight, meaning it's fast to load and doesn't bloat your app. Its ecosystem is massive, from state management like Vuex and Pinia to the routing systems like Vue Router. It's all there. It's high performing, it will optimize for the speed and responsiveness, and it offers a built-in reactivity. Your UI updates automatically when your data changes. So whether you are just getting into the web development or looking to level up your front-end skill, Vue.js is definitely worth your attention. So how are we going to be installing Vue.js? First up, we need to open our terminal and we have to type npm init vue at latest. This will launch the Vue.js project scaffolding tool. It will first ask you to provide a name for your project. I'm gonna call mine as a Vue Learning, and you can call it whatever you prefer. Next, it will prompt you to choose some optional features like TypeScript, Vue Router, and so many more. For now, I'm going to just skip all of them and hit enter. Once the setup is complete, we need to navigate to that folder by using the cd Vue Learning project. Then we have to install all of the dependencies by which our Vue.js depends on. So we are going to be using npm I or npm install to install all of the packages. Finally, I'm going to open their project in the VS Code by using the code dot, so it's going to open there in my VS Code. Let's take a look at the folder structure. So the first folder that we have is a node modules folder, and this folder contains all of the dependencies your project needs. Basically all the code from the packages you have installed via the npm. You would never touch this folder manually. It's auto-generated once you run the npm install command. Then we have a public folder. This folder holds the static assets, those files that do not go through the build process, something which you don't have to worry about. Then we have the heart of the Vue.js, which is called the src or the source folder. This is where your actual application code lives. You will spend most of your time in this specific folder. After that, we have the .gitignore file, and this file tells the Git which file and folder to ignore in the version control. For example, the node modules, the environment variable file, or the output build process, something which you don't have to worry about. Then we have an index.html file. This is the main HTML file that acts as an entry point for your Vue app. Vue will inject your entire app into this file. Then we have a package.json file. This is a super important file. It defines your project name and version, all of your dependencies, and all of the scripts to run your project. For example, the npm run dev, npm run build, and npm run test, and so many other things. Then we have a readme.md file. This is where you can write the description for your project. It is useful for anyone who opens the repo, especially if you are sharing it on the GitHub. Then we have a widget.config.js file. Since Vue 3 uses the widget as a build tool by default, this is a config file for the widget. It is used to customize how your app is built and served. You usually won't need to change anything at first. And that's the basic folder structure of the Vue.js project. So what is component? A component is a piece of UI that has its own logic and appearance. A component can be small as a button or large as an entire page. Now, to put that in simple words, a component is like a building block for your website. Imagine it as a small reusable part of your web page that you can easily use in different places. Now let me give you the analogy of a component. So you can think of the component as like a building block that you can use over and over again to build different things. Imagine you want to build this UI without using a component. So first of all, we are going to be creating an index.html file, and we will store the entire structure of this project in that one specific index.html file. Then we are going to be defining an index.css file, and inside there we are going to be storing this entire project styling inside that one index.css file. And same will goes for the index.js file, and we are going to be storing all of the logic of this specific file inside that index.js file. Now it will work totally fine, But imagine if our project goes bigger and bigger, so will our index.html file, CSS file, and our JavaScript file. And this is not a better way to build our project. So the better way is to use a component. So we can split this entire UI into multiple components. So we can create a component for the navigation, we can create a component for the search bar, for the menu, and we can also create a component for the card. And then we can reuse that component again and again to build this entire UI. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, that component can be small as a button or large as an entire page. So this is how we are going to be splitting our UI into multiple components. So now let me show you how we are going to be creating a hello world component in Vue.js. So we can totally create our component inside our app.vue file, but I prefer to create a separate file for each of the component. So I'm going to define a components folder, and inside there I will define another file with the name of hello world.vue. And inside this file we are going to be defining our component. If you want to create a component inside the Vue.js, there are three sections that you have to remember. The first one is a script for adding your JavaScript logic. The second one is template for writing your HTML, the UI structure. Third one is style for writing your CSS style for your component. Now in this case, we want to create a simple component to render the hello world to the screen. So we don't have to provide anything inside the script tag. We don't have to provide anything inside the style tag, but I'm going to go into this template and I'm going to just write like h1 hello world, and then I'm going to open my terminal and I'll write like npm run dev, and once I hit run, then I'm going to navigate to that specific link and it's going to show us hello world on the screen. So this is how we are going to be defining a simple component in Vue.js. Let's talk about the text interpolation. So text interpolation refers to the process of dynamically binding data to the content of HTML element in the template. It allows you to display the value of JavaScript expression or a variable within the markup. So the syntax is to open and close the double curly braces, and inside there we have to specify your JavaScript expression. So now let me just show you there in action. I'm gonna go inside the JavaScript land, which means I'm gonna have to go inside the script tag, and I will declare a variable with the name of my message, and I'm going to store the yellow word inside there. So this is how we are going to be declaring our variable. But now let's suppose if you want to display the content of this specific variable into our DOM, so how in the world we are going to be doing there? To do that, we are going to be going inside the template tag, and we have to just create our h1, and inside this h1 we have to provide the double curly braces, and inside those curly braces we have to specify the variable name. So once I do that, and if I check this out, here you can see we are now getting the yellow word. Now let me give you a few more examples. So I'm gonna go inside the script tag once again, and here we're going to be defining another variable with the name of my number, and I'm gonna store the 100 inside there. And I'm going to also create a simple function which will allows us to add two numbers, and then I'm going to go inside the template tag. Here we are going to be rendering the content of my number variable, and then I'm going to also create another h1 which will say 2 plus 2 is equal to, and then inside the curly braces we are going to be providing our 2 plus 2. So basically it's going to give us like 2 plus 2, which is the label, and then it's going to give us the 4. And now underneath there we are going to be calling our function in this case. So I'll just write like add two numbers, and then I'm going to call my function inside there, and for the x argument I'm going to pass 2, for the y argument I'm going to also pass 2. So it's going to combine there, and it's going to give us the 4 as a result. So once I open my browser, it's going to give us the yellow word 100, 2 plus 2 equal to 4, add two numbers, and it's going to give us 4. So this is how we can use the text interpolation in Vue.js. But there is also one thing that you have to keep in mind. This is not allowed. If I try to declare a variable inside the curly braces, this is not allowed. We can specify the JavaScript expressions, but we cannot declare a variable inside there. So what is attribute bindings? Attribute bindings is a way to bind HTML attributes to the data in Vue instance. So there are two ways to do that. The older way is to just use the vbind method, and the newer way is to just use the colon and attribute name. So now let me just show you that in action. So I'm going to go back to the JavaScript land, and here we are going to be defining a few variables. The first variable I will define is my channel, in which I'm going to store my channel link. Then I'm going to define another variable for the amazing image, in which I will just store a simple image. I'm going to also define an alternative text, which will just say like just a random picture. I'm going to also define the image width and also the image height. So this is how we are going to be defining our variables. But now let's bind them for our HTML attributes. First of all, I'm going to show you the older way, which is to use the vbind method and provide your attribute name, and then specify your value inside there. This will totally work perfectly fine, but this is the older way of doing things. Now the newer way is to just use the colon, and you don't have to specify the vbind method again and again. You just have to specify the colon and then href and then specify my channel as a variable value, and it will work totally fine. Now let me go ahead and go to the image, and here we're going to be binding an amazing image as a source for this image, the image width as a width, the alt tag for the alternative text, and the image height for the height of this image. So this is how we are going to be binding them. If I visit to a localhost 3000, it's going to give us Hussein Web Dev channel as a link. So if I click on there, it's going to redirect me to my YouTube channel. And here you can also see we have that image, which will have the width of 400 and also the height of 400, and also is going to apply the alternative text for there. So this is how we are going to be binding our HTML attributes. So what is reactivity in Vue.js? Reactivity means that the framework can automatically update the UI when the information behind it changes. So if you want to make something reactive in Vue.js, so for there we have two functions, the reactive function and the ref function. So let's start from the first one, which is the reactive function. So reactive is a function used to create the reactive objects. But what are reactive objects? A reactive object is an object where changes to its properties are automatically detected, triggering updates in the user interface. Basically, it is a way to make the object reactive in Vue.js. But whenever you are using a reactive function, you have to keep one thing in mind. You cannot provide the primitive data types inside the reactive function, which means like you cannot specify the strings, booleans, undefined, null, and so on and so forth. But you can definitely provide the reference data type, which are arrays, objects, and so on and so forth, something which we are going to be covering in a few seconds. So that was about the theory. Now let me show you the in action. So inside my hello world component, first of all, we have to import the reactive function from the Vue.js. Then we will initialize that function, and as you can see, we are now passing a reference data type, not the primitive data type. So which simply means I'm now passing an object. Inside this object, we are now passing a count as a property, and value is going to be set to 0. Then we are now storing the inside the initial state variable, and that's done. Now if you want to show that to the UI, so for that we are going to be using a template, and inside this template we are going to be just providing a count as a label, and then we are interpolating our values. So which simply means that from this initial state variable we only want to access this count value, and that's done. So if you want to preview there inside our browser, so it's going to give us the count which will be set to 0. That's totally done. Now we are going to be adding a button which will allow us to increment our counter by 1 or increase our counter by 1. But for that we are going to need something called the event. So how in the world we are going to be attaching an event listener in Vue.js? So if you want to attach the event listener in Vue.js, so for that we are going to be using this add click directive, which will allow us to add a click event handler for a specific thing. So now this code simply means that whenever somebody clicks on this button, we want to first of all access the initial state, and from that initial state we want to access the count value, and we want to increment there. That's it. Same will goes for the decrement button, which will allow us to decrease our counter by 1. So we are now once again attaching the event listener. So whenever somebody clicks on this, so we want to access the initial state.count, and we want to decrement there by 1. So if you preview there inside the browser, so it's going to give us the count which will be set to 0, and it's going to give us two buttons, the increment and the decrement button. So whenever somebody clicks on the increment button, so it's going to increase our counter by 1. But whenever somebody clicks on the decrement button, so it's going to decrease our counter by 1. So that was the example number 1. Now let me give you one more example. So once again, we're going to need to import the reactive function from the Vue.js. Then we are going to be using that reactive function, but inside there we are now passing two reference values. So first of all, we are now passing the value which will be set to a nested object. Then we are providing a users, which is also a reference value, which is the array. So inside that array we have a Hussein and Jordan, and that's it. Now let's go to the UI. So first of all, from this initial state we want to check for the value, and from that specific value we want to access that count. So it's going to give us the value of 0. Now we are going to be also showing that users, so we have to go to the initial state and then the dot users. So it's going to give us all of that users. Now we are going to be attaching an event listener. So whenever somebody clicks on this button, so it's going to add that counter by 10. That's totally done. Then we are going to be attaching another button which will allow us to change the users. Here I'm providing a uses, but it should be a users. Okay, so let's just create that function separately. So we are going to be defining this function. So inside this function, first of all, we are now accessing the initial state dot user and then the user 0, which means like we are going to be accessing the first user and we want to change the value of that to Michael. Then we are going to be accessing the second user and we want to change the value of that to Philip. Now let's add the final click event handler, which will allows us to push the new user, and that's it. So once again, we are now just accessing the initial state.user and we are now pushing a new user to there, which is a John Doe. So it's going to add a new user to this list. That's totally done. Now let's just preview there inside the browser. So I'm going to go to my browser. So first of all, we have a current count which is set to 0. Then we have a users which is Hossein and Jordan. So we have 3 buttons which will do something. So first of all, if we click on this add 10, it's gonna add 10 to our counter. That's the first thing. The second thing is if I click on the change user, so it's gonna change the username to Michael and Philip. And if I click on the last button, so it's gonna add a new user to this list right here. So that was the example number 2. And now let me show you what if you provide the primitive data type. So let me just show you there. So once again, we have to import the reactive function, and in this case, we are now providing a primitive data type, which means like we are only specifying a 0. This 0 is not inside the curly braces and not inside the simple brackets. So which means like we are specifically specifying the primitive data type and it will not work. Okay, so it will not work if you try there. So it's going to give you an error that primitive value cannot be assigned to the reactive function, and that's it. So that was it about the reactive function. Let's talk about the ref function. So ref is used to create the reactive reference to a value. Unlike the reactive function, which is used for creating a reactive object, ref is specifically designed for creating a reactive single values. And you can store any value which you prefer. You can store the primitive data types. You can also store the reference data types if you prefer there. So that was just a theory. Now let me show you there in action. We have to import the ref function from the Vue.js. Then we are going to be initializing there, and in this case we are now passing a primitive data type, which means like we are only passing a 0 value to there. Then we are storing the inside the count variable, and that's done. Now let me go to the UI, and here we are going to be passing a count as a label, and then we are going to be interpolating our value inside there. That's totally done. Now let me attach 2 buttons which will allows us to increment our counter and decrement our counter. And remember, in this case we are not specifying like counter dot some value and then plus plus, like initial state dot count and then plus plus. We are just directly providing a count plus plus and count minus minus. So it's gonna allows us to increment and decrement our counter by 1. So let's just preview there inside our browser. So as you can see, we have our count which is now set to 0. So if I click on this plus button, so it's gonna increment our counter anytime I click on there. And if I click on this minus button, so it's gonna decrement our counter anytime I click on there. So that was the example number 1. Now let me give you one more example. So once again, we have to import our ref. Then we are going to be creating a ref, and in this case we are still providing a primitive data type, which means like we are only providing an empty string. Then we are storing the inside the username. Let's just go to the UI, and then we have to render that username. Now we are going to be attaching a button, so whenever somebody clicks on this button, so it's going to change the username to the value of Jordan. So let's just preview there. So here you can see I have a add user and I don't have nothing inside there. So if I click on this button, so it's going to give us that Jordan right here. So that was the example number 2 of the ref. So what are computed properties? A computed property is a special kind of variable that automatically updates itself whenever the data it depends on changes. So it's like a little worker that watches a certain data, performs some work on it, and always give you the most up-to-date result. So that was just a theory. Now let me show you that in action. So once again, we have to import the computed and ref from the Vue.js. Then we are going to be declaring a variable with the name of first name, and inside there we are going to be storing the value of reactive Hussein value. For the last name, we are going to be storing the reactive web dev value. And now for the full name, we are going to be using the computed function, which will allows us to make it so that it's going to give us the most up-to-date value. So we are just passing an arrow function inside there. Then we are just concatenating that first name value and also the last name value. So now if you go to the UI, and this is how we are going to be rendering there to the UI. So if we just preview this, so it's going to give us Hussein Web Dev on the screen. So what is conditional rendering in Vue.js? So conditional rendering refers to the ability to conditionally display or hide elements in the UI based on a certain condition or expression. So just like in JavaScript, we use conditional statement to control the flow of our program. Now in this case, we are going to be using that same conditional rendering methods like if, else if, and else to show or hide something from the UI. So first of all, we are going to be using the if directive. So if some condition is true, gives us one response. If that condition is false, jump to the next condition, which is the else if. And then we are going to be specifying another condition. If that condition is true, gives us one result. But if this condition also fails, then finally jump to the else block. And we are going to be also seeing something called the show directive, which is coming very soon. Let me show you that in action. So I'm gonna go into my script, and inside there, let's just declare a variable with the name of isTrue, and I'm gonna be holding the value of true inside there. I'm gonna declare another variable with the name of isFalse, and it's gonna hold the value of false inside there. Now let me go ahead and go to my template, and inside there, let's just provide a paragraph which will say like this will show if the isTrue is true. And we are also providing the if directive, and for the condition we are now passing the isTrue value inside there. So if we preview the inside the browser, it's gonna give us that result like this will show if the isTrue is true. And why is that? Because this condition is true. Because we are now providing the isTrue, and isTrue is now holding the value of true. So that's why we can see this result right here. But what about if you want to specify the else condition or the else if condition? So for that, we are going to be once again providing another paragraph which will say like this will show if the isFalse is true. So in this case, we are now providing the else if right here, and we are now passing the isFalse. But if we preview there, it's gonna still gives us like this will show if the isTrue is true, but it will not gives us that other line. And why is that? Because that condition is false, so that's why it will not show that line of code. So now what if both conditions are false? So here you can see the isTrue is now set to false, the isFalse is also set to false. So we are also providing the else directive right here, which will say like this will show if neither the isTrue nor isFalse is true. So if we preview this, so it's going to give us like this will show if neither the isTrue nor isFalse is true. So it is working the way we expect them to work. Let's talk about the show directive. So the show directive is used for the conditional rendering. It toggles the visibility of an element based on the truthiness of the provided expression. So unlike the if, which completely adds or removes the element from the DOM, show toggles the CSS display property of the element to control its visibility while keeping it in the DOM. So now let me show you the in action. So once again, we have to import the ref, and now we are going to be declaring the isVisible, and inside there we are going to be using the ref of true. Then we are going to be going inside the template, and here you can see we have our paragraph which will say like this paragraph will be shown or hidden based on the value of isVisible. We are also providing the show directive today, and for the condition we are now providing the isVisible right here, which is initially set to true. Then we are going to be also attaching a button which will allows us to toggle the visibility of that specific line of code. Okay, so if we preview the inside the browser, so it's going to give us like this paragraph will show or hidden based on the value of isVisible. And we also have a toggle visibility button right here. So whenever we click on this button, it's going to toggle the visibility of there. If we click on there once again, so it's going to unhide there right here. This is how we are going to be using the show directive. Let's talk about the v-for directive in Vue.js. So the v-for directive is used to iterate over an array or an object and render a template for each item in a collection. But what does that actually mean? To put that in a simple word, you can think about the v-for directive just like a JavaScript for loop, which is also used for a collection of data whenever you want to iterate over some data and you want to do something with that data. So you can think about the v-for as a for loop in JavaScript. Let me show you that in action. So we have to import the ref, then we have to create a list of data so that we can iterate over through there. Then we are going to be creating a paragraph, and now for this paragraph we are now specifying the v-for directive. So this line simply means that we want you to iterate over through the entire pupils list, and for each iteration add every single person to the person variable and then render that to the UI. That's as simple as that. So if we preview that inside the browser, so it's gonna first of all iterate over through the entire list, and then it's gonna render each person to the UI. But there is one catch that you have to keep in mind, which is called the keys. So what are keys and why should you even care about that? When Vue renders a list of elements, it uses something called the virtual DOM to determine the most efficient way to update the actual DOM. The key helps Vue.js identify which element have changed, been added or removed from the DOM. Without the keys, Vue may need to recreate the entire DOM structure for each update, which can be less efficient. So now let me just rewrite all of that code to use the keys. So first of all, we have to import the ref, then we have to just create a list of data. Still, we are going to be using that Vue4 directive, and here we are now passing a person and also the index, which will iterate over through the pupils. And in this case, we are also passing a key directive right here, which will take the index for each person in the list. So if we preview this, so once again, it's going to iterate over through the entire list, and then it's going to render each person to the UI. So what are props and why should you even care about them? Props, also known as properties, are a way to pass data from a parent component to a child component. Props allow you to communicate between components by allowing the parent component to pass data down to its child component. This is useful for creating reusable and modular components. Now let me show you the in action. So here you can see I have two components, the hello world component and the static prop component. You can give it any name which you prefer, but in my case that will do it. So inside the hello world component, I'm going to import the static prop component and I'm going to call that inside this hello world component. So now it's going to make it so that hello world component is now the parent component and the static props component is now the child component. Now from this hello world, which is the parent component, we are going to be passing some sort of a data down to its child component, which is the static prop component. So this is how we are going to be passing that data right here. And basically you can specify any name which you prefer and you can specify any value which you prefer. But in my case, I'm only passing a name, and that's going to be basically anything. You can specify like banana, orange, or your name, or any name which you prefer. And also for the value, I'm now passing a Jordan, and that value can be number, that can be string, that can be boolean and undefined, and so on and so forth. So this is how we are going to be passing a data from the parent component down to its child component. But now the question is, how in the world we are going to be receiving their data inside the child component? Now let me go ahead and go to the static props component. So we are going to be using something called the define props function, which will take array as a value. Inside this array, we have to specify the name of our prop. In this case, we are now providing a name, so I'm going to also specify a name inside there. Then we are going to be storing that inside the props variable, but you can give it any name which you prefer. We can also log that to the console and we can also show that to the UI. So if we preview that inside the browser, so it's going to give us that Jordan right here, and that's because we passed the Jordan value, so that's why we are now receiving that. Let me show you how we are going to be passing a dynamic data from the parent component down to its child component. So once again, I have two components, the hello world.view and the dynamic props component right here. So I'm going to first of all import the dynamic props component, and inside there we are going to be calling there right here. And now inside the hello world script, we are going to be defining the first name and also the last name by using the ref. Now we are going to be providing those values dynamically to their dynamic component. So to do that, we are going to be using this syntax, which is to just use the colon, and then for the property, you can give it any name which you prefer. But in my case, I just give it the same name like the first name, and the value is also holding the first name, and the last name, which is also holding the value of last name right here. Now if you go to the dynamic props component, we're going to be once again using the dynamic props, and inside there, let's just specify the first name, last name, and store them inside the props variable. Now if you want to show that to the UI, so this is how we are going to be showing there by using the text interpolation. So if you want to preview there, so it's going to give us like first name will be set to Alex and last name will be set to Mercer. Let me give you one more example. In this case, we are going to be changing the value of our prop, and spoiler, it will not work. So let me go ahead and go to my hello world component. So we are going to be importing and calling our component. Then we are going to be creating a variable which will be holding the value of 7. And inside there, we are going to be passing that value down to its child component. And if you go to the parent component, this is how we are going to be importing that value. And now if we try to change that value, it will not work. It will throw us an error that props are immutable, which means like their values are read only. You cannot change the value. So this is what immutable means. Immutable simply means that you can read the data, but you cannot change the data. On the other hand, we have another word which is called mutable, which means like we can change the data. But in this case, we have the word which is immutable, so which means like we cannot change this data. So if we just try to render this, so it's going to give us an error. Let's talk about the slot. A slot is like a space in a component where you can put different things. It allows you to create a reusable component that can accept different content while maintaining a consistent structure. Let me show you the in action. So here you can see I have two components, the hello world component and the slot component. So inside the slot component, I'm gonna first of all define just a opening and closing slot, and that's it. This is how we are going to be defining an empty space in our component, and now in this space we can put any content which we prefer. So now let me go ahead and go to my hello world component, and now we are going to be importing that component, and now we have to call this component right here. So we already defined an empty slot in our slot component. Now we are going to be providing a value or a data to there. So this is how we can specify our content, and basically this can be any HTML content. You can specify like the input tag, the image tag, or the section tag or anything, but in my case I'm going to only specify like the content 1 and the content 2. So if we preview this, it's going to give us like the content 1 and the content 2. Let's talk about the fallback content. So the fallback content in slot refer to the default content that is displayed when no content is provided for a particular slot. It's a way to ensure that the component still has a meaningful content even if the parent component does not pass any content to a specific slot. Now let me show you the in action. So once again, I have two components. Inside the static prop component, I'm going to define a slot, but in this case I am going to specify a default value to there. So I'm passing the h1, which will say like this is a fallback slash default content. Now let me go ahead and go to my hello world component, and we are going to be importing that component, and we have to call this component right here. But remember, we are not specifying any content directly to our component. It's gonna take all of that content from the fallback content which we are now providing for our component inside our static prop component. So if we preview there, it's gonna give us like this is a fallback slash default content right here. But now let me just show you one more example. In this case, I am specifying a paragraph which will say like fallback will not work because I am providing a content inside this component. So if you want to preview there, let's just check this out. Here you can see it's going to give us like fallback will not work because I am providing a content inside our component. So this is how the fallback content works inside the slots. Let's talk about the name slot. So a name slot is a way to assign a specific name to a slot in a component. Unlike a default slot which is unnamed and used when no explicit name is provided, name slots allow you to have multiple slots in a component and specify where the content should be inserted based on the slot name. So now let me show you the in action. So once again, I have two components, the hello world and the name slot component. So inside the name slot component, I'm going to define two slots with different names, name 1 and name 2. Now let me select the name 1 slot and provide some content to there by using my hello world component. So let's just go inside the hello world component. We are going to be defining our template, and then for that specific template we are going to be providing the v slot directive, and then we are going to be providing the 1 as a name, and inside that specific slot we are going to be providing our h1, which will say like this content will go to the slot 1. Okay, so this is the first way we can do that, but there is also one other way to do that, which is by using the hash symbol, and then we have to specify the slot name, and then inside that template you can specify your content, and this will totally work. So if you preview there, it's gonna give us like this content will go to the slot 1 and the slot 2. Let's talk about the provide and inject options in Vue.js. The provide and inject options are used for providing and injecting properties or data down to the component hierarchy. They enable a form of dependency injection, allowing a parent component to provide a data or method that a child component can then inject and use. But what does that actually mean? To put that in simple terms, I want to tell you a story. So here you can see here is my component hierarchy where I have a app, header, nav, card, user, data, and time component. and inside the app component I have some sort of a data which I want to pass down to the data component, which you can see right here at the bottom. But the question is, how in the world we are going to be passing that data which is available inside the app component down to the data component? Well, the first answer is we're going to have to pass that data down to, first of all, the card component by using the props. Then we have to pass that to the user component. Finally, we are going to be passing that to the data component, and mission successful. That was the mission impossible final reckoning. Now it will solve our problem, but imagine you are working with a bigger company like Twitter or Meta or Facebook or some big organization like they're gonna have a lot of component, like thousand and thousand of component. So what you will do is that you will just pass your data down to the child component by using the props? Of course not. This is something called the prompt drilling, which I already cover in my React.js course. So what's the solution? I want this data to pass directly into this data component. I don't want to pass that data to the card component, to the user component, and so on and so forth. So how in the world we are going to be achieving this behavior? To achieve that, we are going to be using something called the provide function and the inject function. So let's start from the first one, which is the provide function. So provide is an option in parent component that allows it to share data or method with its child component. It makes properties or methods available for injecting into the component. So that was it about the provide function. Let's talk about the inject function. Inject is an option in a child component that specify which properties or method it wants to receive from the parent component. It allows a component to inject and use provided data or methods. So now let me show you that in action. But before we do that, I want to give you the example which will not use the provide and inject. Then we will refactor that code to use the provide and inject. So as you can see, we have a hello world component, school component, and the student component. Now let me go ahead and go inside the hello world component, and we have to import the school component. Then we are going to be declaring three variables: the student name, student age, and student location. Now let me go ahead and go inside the template component, and here we are going to be calling our component, and we are going to be passing all of their data as a prop. So this is how we are going to be passing our data from the parent component to the school child component, and now let's receive all of their data by using the props. So this is how we are going to be receiving all of their data, and also we have to import the student component in this case. Now let me go ahead and go inside the template. So here we are going to be calling our student component, and then we are going to be passing their data which we import as a prop to the student component. And finally we have to go inside the student component, and we have to import all of their props, and then we would be able to use that inside our UI. So this is how our prop drilling work. Like first of all, we have to take their data from the hello world component, then we have to pass that to the school component, then to the student component, and finally we have to use that inside the student component. And this is just a simple example, but imagine like you are working with like 100 or 1000 component. That's going to be a huge mess. Now this does solve our problem. So now let me just show you there. So it's going to give us like the student name, which will be set to Alex, age will be set to 20, and same will goes for the location. So this solve our problem, but this is not the better and the efficient way of doing things. So now let's just refactor that code to use the provide and inject. Now let me go ahead and go to my hello world component, and now we are going to be rewriting that code to use the provide and inject. So first of all, we have to import our provide function from the Vue.js, then we have to import our school component, and then we are going to be using the provide function, and inside there we are going to be passing the prop name, and then we are going to be providing a value for a specific prop. So in this case, I am now passing like the student name, which will be set to Alex, and the student age, which will be set to 20, and student location, which will be set to Earth, and I don't know. Now let me go to the template, and here we have to just pass our school component. And as you can see, we are not going to be passing any prop to the school component. We are going to be going straight into the student component. And here we have to import the inject function from the Vue.js, and then we have to inject all of that values by using that inject function, and then we have to store that inside the variable. So in this case, I'm now injecting the student name, and I'm storing that inside the student name variable. Then I'm injecting the student age, and same will goes for the student location. So now let me just render that to the UI, and this is how it's gonna look like. So now let me just show you there, and it's gonna look exactly the same. But now this is the efficient way of doing things. Let's talk about the watchers. So watchers allows us to reactively watch for changes in a specific property or expression and perform some custom logic when that property or expression changes. So watchers are also a part of Vue.js reactivity system, which enables the framework to automatically update the DOM when the underlying data changes. So how this syntax will look like? This is how the syntax will look like. First of all, we are going to be calling a watch function. It's going to take the source, callback, and option. So a source can be a ref, the reactive object, array, or a getter function, and a callback function will be called whenever some data behind it changes. And finally, we have an option which can be immediate, deep, flush, on trigger. So now let me show you the in action. So here you can see we have a basic component. First of all, we are going to be importing the ref and the watch function from the Vue.js. Then we are going to be creating two state, the message and the input text state. So then we are going to be calling the watch function. For the source, we are going to be providing the input text, and for the callback, we are going to be providing a new value and old value as a parameter today. Now inside this function, we are going to be changing the value of message to uType and whatever the user type inside that new value. So now let me go to the template, and here we are going to be rendering the content of that message, and finally we would need some input field in which we are going to be typing our text or our message. So now let me just show you the in action. So here you can see it's going to give us like hello Vue, but whenever I type something inside my input field, so it's going to give us like u type h, u type u, x, n, and this is how it's going to work. Let's talk about the template ref. So a template ref is a way to create a reference to a child component, just an element or a DOM element within a template. This allows us to access and manipulate the reference object directly in your component logic. Refs are commonly used to interact with the child component, trigger imperative action, or access properties and method of the DOM element. So now let me show you the in action. So inside my basic ref component, I will import my own mounted and also the ref from the Vue.js. Then I'm going to define my state by using the ref. After that, we are going to be calling the onMounted function, which simply means whenever our component first mounts or first render to the DOM. So in this situation, we are going to be getting the reference and we want to get the value of there and we want to focus that value. Then we are going to be getting the actual value from that ref and we can change that to basically anything. But in my case, I'm going to just change that to something. Now let me go ahead and go inside the template, and here we are going to be pasting our input field, but as you can see I am also pasting a ref which will be also set to my ref, which is the initial state which we've created up above. So if we preview this, so it's going to initially gives us our simple input field, but whenever our component renders, so it's going to focus that component and it's going to also provide something inside there. So this is how we are going to be passing a reference to our template. So that was the example number 1. Now let me just give you one more example. So in this one, we are going to be just creating a simple function which will take an element as a parameter to there. Inside there, we can just log that parameter to the console, or we can just change the content of that specific element by using the element.text content, and we can change that content to basically anything. We can do a lot of stuff with there. We can also change the color of that specific element to red or some other color. So this is how we are going to be defining our reference function, but now we have to bind this function to some element. So here you can see I have a h1 which will say like this is the initial value, and we are going to be binding this function by using the ref property which we are now specifying right here. So it's gonna first of all gives us like this is the initial value, and then a few seconds later it's gonna just change their text content and it's gonna also change the color of there. So this is how we are going to be using the template ref in Vue.js. So now let's talk about how we are going to be fetching our data from the Vue.js. So first of all, we have to import the ref, and then we have to create our state by using the ref, and the initial value will be set to null. After that, we have to define our function which will allows us to fetch our data. Inside this function, we have to call our fetch method, and inside the fetch method, we have to pass our URL from which we are going to be fetching our data. Now we are going to be attaching the then method, and inside this then method, we have to specify if the response is not okay, so we are going to be throwing an error. But if that's not the case, we are going to be returning the JSON response. Now we are going to be also attaching a then method, And in this one, we are going to be changing the data.value to the response data, to all of that data which is coming from the JSON placeholder. But if that's not the case, we are going to be also catching an error. So we have to just log that error to the console, and that's it. Now we have to go to the UI, and this is how we are going to be rendering that to the UI. So if somebody clicks on the button, so it's going to fetch all of their data. It's going to render there to the DOM. So now let me just show you there. So it's going to give us like using fetch and also the fetch data button. So whenever I click on there, it's going to give us all of their data.